Denee Mattioli, back here this week. She came and spoke last year, and so we're so pleased to have her back. She's has a degree in education from Westmark College. After that, she taught for 17 years at different educational levels within the school system. She finished her master's and PhD at the University of Iowa during that time, taught at the university level for 20 years, and was a professor at National Louis University in Chicago, Purdue, and East Tennessee State University. She was a Fulbright Scholar to Korea in 2003 and 2004. She's an active member at the Church in Gray, where she's just finished up a term as the president of the board of trustees there. She is married to Charlie. They have 4 children and 3 grandchildren, and seems to be enjoying life quite a bit here in the Johnson City area. So, Denee.
Good morning. I want to just prepare you that I do have familiar tremors, and so if I shake a little bit, I'm okay. It's benign, and you're not frightening me. Okay, I'm not scared. It just happens. So, the topic of my thoughts and words this morning is forgiveness. And I consider it a real privilege to be able to speak what's on my heart and mind and be heard. So thank you for that, offering me that opportunity. What started me thinking about this topic was my trip to South Africa. And after visiting South Africa, and the more I reflected on what I had the privilege to witness, to experience in that beautiful country, the more I wanted to share it with other people. I wanted to talk to people about the experiences that I had, and also talk about the concept, the experience, and the results of forgiveness. So I've traveled a lot in my life around the world. I packed my bags and I headed for 17 days of what I had expected to be a different culture, but similar to other travels that I had had. My job, as in the past, was to lead a group of educators through the multiple learning opportunities offered by firsthand experiences and interacting with people of another culture. I prepared for my trip, and though I wasn't the expert on South Africa, I did the protocol. I made sure everybody was on time, nobody lost their passport, and all that kind of thing. And I prepared for the trip by reading and studying the history, the geography, the government, the politics, and the cultural traditions of South Africa. And I did this for months. But even with this, I was totally unprepared for the emotional impact the people of South Africa would have on me. And I will also give you a prior warning that at one point I may get emotional, because it was such an emotional impact on me. The third day that I was there, I went to Soweto, and that name may sound familiar to you. Soweto is a former township, a community where Black Africans lived, and they were not allowed to leave without passes and identification. And the people of this community suffered greatly for 40 years under the law of apartheid. We visited the Hector Peterson Memorial Museum, and I'll bet for some of you, I see a few people who might be too young for this, but I think most of you, that name is going to ring a bell. But if it doesn't, I'm sure the image in the picture will. Hector was a 13-year-old boy who made the front pages of newspapers all over the world in April of 1976, when a journalist smuggled a picture out of the country. I'm sure, like I said, many of you would recognize his cousin carrying his dead body through gun smoke and so on. What happened there was that Hector was shot and killed along with others when police opened fire on striking school children. This past April was the 40th year commemoration of what is now called the African Uprising. The children were striking because a new law had been passed that all schools in the black communities had to be taught in the Afrikaans language and not their native language, which further suppressed the potential for a good education for them. This picture did bring world attention to apartheid, but it was a turning point, but it still took 18 more years to bring an end to that oppression. Since the end of apartheid, Soweto has received electricity, sewers, and water. But unemployment and poverty is still a huge problem there. It was in this community where I visited a high school, Musi, M-U-S-I, Musi High School, where 841 students and 27 teachers came every day. It was in this high school where people came up to me, students, they're people, right? Students came up to me and shook my hand, and then candidly told me, "You're the first white person I have touched." Most of the students walked to school without breakfast. There was no lunch program, and school is not free. There is a tuition that's charged, but over 80% of the students in Soweto, their families can't pay it, so it's not collected. And while school is by law required, the government only contributes $20 a year per student. So of course, books, pencils, lab equipment, and everything else you can imagine is in short supply or either that or non-existent. So while visiting one class of juniors, I asked the students what they wanted us to remember about South Africa. And I also asked them, what kind of music do you listen to? Because everywhere in the world I travel, I ask teenagers that, and you know what? They listen to the same music our kids listen to. I can't understand the words in German or English or whatever, but they're all listening to that same music. It was different in South Africa. When I asked that question, the teacher just said, "Well, jump up and show her." So they all jumped up and began singing, not in 4-part harmony, 8-part harmony. It was beautiful. It was part of their culture. And so they asked me to join them, and I started dancing the way they were showing, and they all laughed, and finally, and it was clear that they were laughing at me, and I didn't think my moves were that bad. And so I asked them what was wrong, and the girl said, "You're dancing the boys' part." So they had a sense of humor, and they invited me into their classroom and were very hospitable. And then I asked them what they wanted me to tell Americans when I went back. What did they want me to tell Americans about them? And one boy's moving answer was, and I'm quoting here, "We have been isolated for 40 years, and we are a young, struggling democracy. Tell people in America we are trying to overcome all of our problems and become a strong democratic nation, and we are looking to you." I hope they're not looking real close these last few weeks and months. This came from a 16-year-old and was only a hint at what I was to hear throughout my travels in South Africa. My next stop was Cape Town. It's a beautiful city, very much the climate like San Francisco. And I visited the Mandela Apartheid Museum and took the 20-minute ride on a hovercraft to Robben Island. Robben Island is a 3,000-acre island about 2 miles off the coast of Cape Town. It is situated in very cold, very rough, shark-infested waters. It has been a place for outcasts and prisoners for centuries. It was once a leper colony. It was a barracoon for the slave trade. It was a hospital for epileptics and mentally ill who were thought to be possessed by demons. And then it was a place for the African government to put their political prisoners. It is now a World Heritage Site, so designated by the United Nations, as well as a national park and a nature preserve. So we landed at the same dock where Nelson Mandela arrived, and Mbeki, and other political prisoners. There was a huge photographic mural showing them and others walking in chains around their wrists and ankles, marching to the prison with armed guards on either side. We walked their same route. Then we went into the prison compound, and we met a man who was Mandela's guard for the last 10 years that Mandela was there. Our guide was another former prisoner. He was arrested when he was 18 years old, and his crime was participation in the African National Congress, a black political party. He was released 20 years later at the age of 38. His cell was one down from Mandela's. It was almost impossible to imagine the injustice of having his youth stolen from him. However, that was not what moved everyone in the room to tears and silent thought. This man, his name was Patrick, who had been so unjustly treated, expressed the same sentiment with passion that I heard from almost everyone I met in South Africa, regardless of race, color, creed, or ethnicity, and they expressed it to me. Patrick said he was fighting oppressive, unjust ideas, not people. And this is a quote: "If the people are changing, why continue to hate them? My war is against ideas, not people." He spoke with such passion about forgiveness and reconciliation. And we had to believe him. We had to believe that it wasn't just part of his job as a tour guide and former prisoner, because he was working every day side by side with the man who had been his warden for the 20 years he served there. He continued speaking about forgiveness. He said that forgiveness was something must be if the young democracy was to survive. With all the other problems, this one thing had to be true first: that every citizen accepts every other citizen, and that prejudices, bigotry, and injustice has to halt and forgiveness offered. He said, if forgiveness doesn't happen, the country will degenerate into civil war, and the dream, the miracle, will be lost. Yeah, there wasn't a dry eye in that crowd. And I'd like to tell you a little bit more about Patrick, because he was so impressive. We said, what did you do when you weren't at hard labor? And he said, well, through Amnesty International, we were allowed to do classes. They would send books to them and they would read. So many of them educated themselves and even got degrees while in prison. And that was thanks to Amnesty International. And he said they also played chess and checkers. And somebody asked him, did you play chess with Mandela? And he said, yes. And they said, well, what did you talk about? Because we were all so interested about Mandela. And he just smiled. And when we said, what did you say to Mandela? He said, checkmate. And then he shrugged and said, whoever would have known he was going to be president? As we walked through the cells, we heard recorded stories of other prisoners. Many of them spoke of forgiveness, not just in the abstract or in the political plural, but also in their very personal and disrupted lives. One man spent 12 years at Robben Island. His wife, thinking he would never be released, took their 2 children and went off with another man. After giving birth to 2 children, that man abandoned her. But when apartheid ended and this prisoner was released, he listened to the complaints about his wife from his family. They encouraged him to forget her. He too spoke of forgiveness. All people are weak, he said, and she thought I would never come home. He went to his wife, took her back, and is raising all 4 children as his own. On our last day in the Cape Town area, we visited another former township, Guguletto, and that name has also been in the news here. Perhaps that name does sound familiar to you. On August 25th of 1993, Amy Beale, a Stanford student who was studying and working there, was in the process of helping 3 young black women. Even with their screams and pleas from these 3 young women, an angry mob of young black men pulled her from her car and stabbed her to death. How would you respond, I ask myself, if you were the parent and received such news? How much pain and hate would fill my heart? It was also very close because our daughter was at Stanford, and this was a student of Stanford. It would certainly be understandable, the hate and the pain. And some months after her funeral, Amy's parents traveled to Guguleto in the process of working through their grief. They found there the environment and situation of unemployment and poverty under apartheid, which had led the young men to riot. They knew their daughter, and they were proud of her, and proud of the injustices she had worked to put right. Her parents started a bakery and invested in other businesses to provide work and meaning for the young people of Guguleto. The 3 young men who killed her asked for reconsideration during the time of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission meetings. Now, the TRC was It was Act number 34, and it was enacted in 1995 and began to be implemented. And Desmond Tutu was a large part of that. And they were implemented starting in 1996. And so people could ask for reconsideration of their crimes. So I asked myself again, where would you stand, Denee, as the parent of a murdered child? By this time, Amy's father had passed away, but her mother walked hand in hand with the mother of one of the boys who had killed her daughter. They walked hand in hand to the commission meeting, and together they asked for reconsideration and forgiveness of these 3 young men. This act was aired on national television, and it so stunned the nation that it was a catalyst for much healing and further forgiveness. And my voice cracks, and it's been 9 years, and every time I tell this story, I still feel this way. As Ken Graham said in his book on the healing power of love and forgiveness, often we resist extending forgiveness because we seem to feel that it may encourage someone to hurt us again, or that we are somehow condoning their abusive actions by forgiving them. If forgiveness is ever to happen, we must separate the action from the actor. We can forgive the actor but not condone the action, for it is the actor that is forgiven, not the action. This separation of the action from the actor is very important in the forgiving process. Otherwise, we stay focused on the repugnant action which we cannot condone, instead of making the attempt to show compassion for the very real human pain and suffering that more than likely produced the actor's painful behavior toward us in the first place. All of us have hurt others. All of us have done things we are ashamed of. And all of us are in need of forgiveness. If this is true of us, how is it not true for the person we are angry with? How can we deny to others what we ourselves are in so desperate need of? We're all in the same boat. Extending forgiveness is seldom a one-time event. It's a process, a practice, something we must do over and over. Forgiveness is also an attitude, a way of living and relating to others and ourselves. Webster's defines forgiving as allowing room for error or weakness. Too often we see forgiving someone in terms of something we do for another person or ourselves rather than seeing it as an attitude of allowing, as a way of living our lives that allows for others and ourselves to make mistakes and to be weak instead of always having to be right and strong. Forgiveness becomes a way to be in the world, something we are rather than something we do. Holding on to the approach of doing forgiveness is one of the reasons forgiving is so difficult. When we begin to see forgiveness as an attitude that it truly is, as a way to be in the world, the true purpose and meaning of forgiveness becomes much more clear. Forgiving is about withholding judgment and allowing people to be truly human, wounded places and all, without expecting others or ourselves to be perfect. Living forgiveness is searching for a way to open our heart in the midst of our anger and pain. And again, some words from Dr. Ken Graham. When I do not see the innate innocent in others, I feel anger and fear. When I do not see my own innate innocence, I feel guilty. Forgiveness corrects both of these misperceptions. Forgiveness realizes people always or usually do the best they can. Forgiveness means I give up my need to be right and my need to analyze. Ooh, that stings when I say it to myself. I can analyze something right into the ground. And judge others, even my need to understand and be understood. And the moment that I extend forgiveness, I begin to see the true world of innocence, healing, and love that is always present for me. Living a life of love and forgiveness may not change what needs to be said or done, but it does often change how and why something is said and done. Because living love and forgiveness also demands we stand against the forces of injustice and oppression, to not tolerate their existence. Our ability to do this from a place of love, acceptance, and forgiveness, not being seduced into becoming what we are standing against, is the challenge of a lifetime. Since we all live love and forgiveness so poorly, most of us just give up on the possibility as some misguided utopian ideal, and we seem to be saying, if it can't be done perfectly, it's not worth trying. But it is in the practicing that we succeed. We become transformed and healed by making the effort, by our practice, not attainment of the goal. The executive director of the Worldwide Forgiveness Alliance, Robert Plath, yeah, there really is such an organization. I didn't know about that. He says that forgiveness is a difficult concept for people in the midst of conflict to understand. It seems like weakness. It seems like to forgive is to condone abuse and violence to ourselves. Yet, he says, I believe that the more one can forgive, the better able they are to still seek justice and refuse to tolerate abuse. The Worldwide Forgiveness Alliance defines forgiveness and outlines 17 steps for forgiveness. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to go over all 17, but I would like to highlight just a couple of them. In the discussion of these steps, they cite studies, and these studies were only done in women, that clearly show anger and resentment can as much as double the risk of myocardial heart attacks in women with previous coronary problems. Other studies indicate cancer and other deadly illnesses are also greatly contributed, that anger and resentment are great contributors to those diseases. So step number 2 says, be willing for your own sake to begin to process out these deadly emotions as soon as possible. Step 9 says, decide to forgive even if the decision is only half-hearted at first. It will probably lessen your hurt and anger immediately. And step 11 says, be aware that being forgiving is a courageous act on your part. It has nothing to do with whether the other person can admit they're wrong. You are forgiving to liberate yourself no matter what the other person decides to do. So I love the picture that's in your bulletin this morning of the chains letting the birds go. In redefining forgiveness, the Alliance states, forgiveness is the movement from working against one another at cross purposes, win-lose conflict, to working together, win-win cooperation. Whenever there is conflict, non-forgiveness abides. Wherever there is cooperation, working together rather than at cross purposes, considerable forgiveness has already occurred to make it possible. Forgiveness empowers reconciliation where estrangement has prevailed. Forgiveness empowers reunion where hostility has prevailed. Forgiveness empowers our acceptance of others where non-acceptance has prevailed. Forgiveness is a creative act that changes us from prisoners of the past to liberated people at peace with our memories. Non-forgiveness keeps us in the middle of the struggle. Forgiveness is also an act of an imagination. It dares us to imagine a better future, one that is based on the possibility that our hurt will not be the final word on the matter. Forgiveness is a giving act, as forgiveness breaks the cycle of hatred, resentment, anger, and pain that is often passed on to those around us. I did read another article about forgiveness by Aldana Bhutan, and she says that in the original Sanskrit meaning of forgiveness, it means to untie. And she talks about forgiveness in this way. Imagine the person you cannot forgive as someone who once held a fishing pole. They've set it down long ago and gone off to do other things, perhaps even hurting others. In the meantime, you are still floundering in the murky waters of the past, snagged on their hook. As long as you are spending precious energy resenting, hating, and being angry, you will be unable to swim freely. What she was asking us to do is gently remove ourselves from the hook that keeps us tangled in the past. She says, think of forgiveness as letting go and swimming free. A few years ago at Yom Kippur, a Jewish friend of mine talked to me about their tradition of asking for forgiveness from those she had wronged during the past year. She took it very seriously, and our conversation caused me to do some further reading. I found an article written by Rabbi David Blumenthal, who taught Jewish studies at the Georgetown Pontifical University, and he wrote about the Jewish understanding and tradition of forgiveness. Asking for forgiveness is called teshuvah. It might be teshuvah, if anybody knows the correct. Repentance requires 5 elements: recognition of one's wrongs, remorse, desisting from repeating the wrong, restitution where possible, and confession. Recognition of one's wrongs is an act of intelligence and moral conscience. Remorse is a feeling. It is composed of regret of our failure to maintain our moral standards. Desisting from repeating the wrong is neither a moral or intellectual analysis nor a feeling. It's an action and a ceasing from that particular behavior. Restitution is another act of making good as best one can for any damage done. And confession has 2 forms, according to Rabbi Blumenthal: ritual and personal. Rabbinic tradition teaches that all the steps to teshuvah are necessary, but not in any particular order, and that's in a spiral. And so whenever you touch one of these, you keep improving, and it is one that continues that process again. As one cycles through the 5 phases of teshuvah again and again, one's teshuvah becomes more earnest, more serious, and at its height, one achieves full teshuvah, which would require full consciousness and action, such that given the exact same situation, one would refrain from the behavior for which one has repented. In Greg Lavoie's book, Callings, he tells of going to see an exhibit called Wisdom and Compassion, the Sacred Art of Tibet. And during the exhibit, a group of monks traveling with the Dalai Lama were creating a 6-foot wide mandala. And they had worked for over a month. And it was a spiritual rendering of the cosmos made of colored sand ground from gemstones. Something that Rajan Sharma shared with Charlie and me in a little box, a picture with crushed lime gemstones. And so they said they worked for nearly a month, and they worked silently, bent over the low platform that cradled the growing sacrament. They laid out their intricate geometry and devotion by hand, surrounded constantly by onlookers who stood sometimes for hours, as Mr. Lavoie did, simply watching. In the Buddhist tradition of non-attachment, the monks intended from the very start to dismantle it after a few months on exhibit and to scatter its remains in the sea. All that work wasted, he thought to himself. On the day before the final ritual celebrating its completion, just as the monks were putting the finishing touches on the mandala, a woman jumped over the velvet rope, climbed onto the platform, and trampled it with her feet, screaming something about Buddhist death cults. Lavoie wrote that when he read about it in the paper, sitting in his kitchen, his head filled with images of frontier justice. But when he reached the end of the article, his rage turned to disbelief. In stark contrast to his own malevolent response, the monk's was one of exoneration. We don't feel any negativity, they said. We don't know how to judge her motivations. We are praying for her for compassion and love. Buddhist author Jack Kornfield writes about forgiveness. Sometimes strong action may be needed for our defense. Let this be done with compassion, or our own hatred will poison the response. We can meet the tragedies of the world with what Gandhi called soul force. S-O-U-L, soul force. If you want to see the heroic, look at those who can love and return for hatred. If you want to see the brave, look for those who can forgive. That's a quote from the Bhagavad Gita. Mother Teresa said, if we really want to love, we must learn how to forgive. Many UUs believe that the divine is a spark within each one of us. If so, then ending my comments with Alexander Pope's words seems appropriate. To err is human, to forgive divine. I believe it. Thank you.